Okay, good. Okay, here it is.
Okay, wonderful. So we have people joining. We're giving a couple of minutes. For everyone who just logged in, my name is Christina Silva. I'm the president of NAHJ LA, and I have some directions in the chat. We're going to be using a hashtag if you want to join us and chat about this on Twitter. And then we're also going to be recording this, and we'll share the recording after the fact. And then I put the monitor and the panelists' Twitter handles in the chat so you can see that. So I'll just give it 1 minute as we organize our screen. Okay, let's get started since we have some people on the East Coast and I know it's really late for you all. For those of you joining, my name is Christina Silva. I am an editor at USA Today, and I am also the president of NAHJ Los Angeles. Throughout the pandemic, the #1 request that we've received from our members is for support on mental health issues. This is something that has come up time and again in the past few months from our members as they are juggling stress with their jobs, with their friends and family, concerns about what's going to happen with their health, with the health of their friends or family, concerns about the industry as we're seeing many people lose jobs in journalism, many people being subject to furloughs and pay cuts, losing their benefits, and so on. It's a really shaky time in our industry, and then it's not obviously just us. Our friends and family in some cases are also losing their jobs. And all of this is unfolding at a time when maybe the normal things that we do for stress, we're not able to have access to, to go get your mani-pedi or a massage or have brunch with your friends or go have a sleepover with your best friend or however you relieve stress. So it's really important to have this conversation and to include everything from the PTSD some of us experience while doing to just the everyday stress of constant pressures of deadlines and the competitive nature of our industry. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Jesus. Ayala is, sorry, I'm turning up this. Jesus Ayala is a professor of broadcast journalism at California State University, Fullerton. He is a TV news veteran, and before that, he spent 16 years, before he was a professor, he spent 16 years as a traveling news producer for ABC News. He's covered wars and civil disturbances overseas, and he's experienced all kinds of reporting on natural disasters from earthquakes to wildfires and floods and tsunamis and hurricanes. Jesus is going to be our moderator tonight, and he is going to introduce our panelists. If you have any questions throughout this conversation, please put your questions in the chat. We're going to ask some predetermined questions to the panel, and then in about 40 minutes, we'll open it up to questions from the group. And with that, thank you so much, Jesus, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you for the invite. I really, really, really appreciate this. This is something that really hits really close home for me. We'll dive into some of those reasons in a bit. But before we came on, Christina and I were talking about how this is really long overdue, right? So we this is an area that has really been taboo for many of us. 20 years ago, when I was starting my career and I was being deployed to cover, some of those really intense stories, this is not something that was being talked about in our newsrooms. Yes, we did in fact go to hostility training, but those trainings were more about, well, if you get kidnapped, this is what you do. But no one was actually talking about how to manage stress. No one was talking about the warning signs. No one was talking about, if you get anxiety or if you get insomnia, that's not normal. So this is something that I think many of us wish, was more at the forefront many years ago. Sadly, it wasn't. I think that, maybe it was in other circles, but it wasn't so much in the journalism circle. I think because, many of us just want to insulate ourselves and pretend that sometimes things are, going well. Also for Latinos, let's admit it, we're not the best at, articulating mental health. We haven't been taught how to. So, I'm really, really glad that we have someone from Dart Center here today, because I really think that they have put this at the forefront from journalists. And, if it really wasn't for all the work they've been doing for the past, few years, we really probably would still not having this conversation, which is a very, very important one. So I'm very, very pleased to be here as your moderator. Again, it's something that really hits close to, home for me. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But before I do, I wanna introduce you to our panelists. We have a great panel here today. So I'm gonna introduce them, and as I introduce them, I wanna do a check-in. We just wanna check in with you and figure out how you are. So let me start off with Leslie Berestein Rojas. She is the Diverse Communities Editor for KPCC in Southern California, and she has previously covered immigration and emerging communities at KPCC and ran the Multi-American blog, which covered many of those topics. Leslie, ¿cómo estás?
Estoy bien, estoy bien, un poco cansada. A little bit tired, you know, like we all are, right? We've been kind of like, we've been doing this, we've been kind of in this trench now for some time, right? It began with the pandemic, and then it began with, you know, then it just kind of expanded to, you know, the death of George Floyd and the protests, and now we're kind of dealing with all of it. So, and now we're all kind of all feeling the economic effects of it too. So, but you know, I'm doing okay, and our team is doing okay. We're trying to do, you know, a lot with a little, I guess. We're trying to do a lot.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. Okay, next we have Jacqueline Garcia. She is a reporter for La Opinión and has covered immigration, politics, health, healthcare, and education. She previously reported for Estrella TV and Hispanic Link News in Washington, D.C. Jacqueline, welcome. How are you doing? How are you coping?
Gracias, gracias. Well, I must say that I was telling earlier some of you guys that I feel kind of blessed in a way that since the pandemic started, our company like sent us to work from home. In a way, we may say that it's a little bit boring to be home the whole day, but at the same time, like it makes us feel like we are more safe, like they are saying, safer at home. So I think that right now I have been able to cope. I mean, we're on the 4th month, and it's been a little bit tough, but I think that is great. Every time that I turn the TV and then I see the reporters on the field, I just feel that I'm a little bit more lucky than just to be working from home.
Yeah, for sure. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Elana Newman, who is a McFarland Professor of Psychology at the University of Tulsa. And we're very lucky to have her because she really is honestly one of the forefront pioneers and experts on journalism and trauma. She studies the occupational health of journalists as the research director for the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. And she also trains many of us journalists on trauma, science, self-care, and best practices within newsroom. Welcome, Dr. Elana Newman. How are you holding up on your end?
I'm delighted to be here. It's a little late for me, but I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. So thank you all for inviting me.
Yes, it is late for you. You're on the East Coast, so we very much thank you for being here. All right, so look, we're just gonna jump into it, okay? I just wanna jump into it and figure out how everyone is doing, what you're seeing on the ground. So I wanna start with you, Elana. Journalists, you know, since the beginning have, you know, needed to cover traumatic stories. We work long hours, we're workaholics. It's very hard for us to put down our phone. And now with social media and having to tweet and having to do stories for the gram, like it's never ending, right? But this moment is for sure different because we are living in real time through a pandemic. So on your end, from what you're seeing and from checking in with the journalists that you know, how is this moment different?
I think there are a couple things going on. I think, first of all, while some people are used to, freelancers are used to working at home, the whole working at home has even made boundaries harder. It's always been hard to have boundaries, but I think now the boundaries are making it more difficult. I think the risks that you need to take are different. I think that, you know, you need to be thinking differently about sort of covering COVID and your staff, for those of you who are managers. I think the other thing that's a little bit different now too is that some of the stories, well, it's always been the case that stories that are hard to tell are about one's own community, but I do think that we are telling more and more stories that hit our own identities or hit our own communities, and that's very difficult. So I think those two things are actually making it a little more difficult. And then finally, for those of you who are used to working with your colleagues, it's a whole new way of doing things. The Zoom is a new way of doing things. There's just all these craft issues that also are adding to the stress. So I think that those are some reasons why maybe now it's harder than ever. Oh, and one more thing, which is you're all being directly assaulted now. It used to be that you could hold up your hand and say, I'm a journalist, I'm okay. And I think that direct assaults and harassment they've existed, but it's much worse now.
Yeah, we've certainly seen many videos posted online of journalists who, are doing their job and are being harassed by protesters, are being harassed by people who maybe don't share the same political beliefs. Obviously, the rhetoric from the administration of the journalist as an enemy doesn't really help here. So it has been a very dangerous time on the streets. So let me get a little bit into that. And, we will be sharing some tips on how to create boundaries, how to, not be logged on to the computer all day, because obviously that's not healthy. So we will get into that. But before, let's just still continue to lay some of the groundwork here. So, let me go with Jacqueline, because you work for La Opinión, so you are very much plugged into the Latino community. From your time out in the field and reporting on this community, what are some of the things that you are seeing in the community right now?
Well, I gotta start by saying that the people that know me, every time that I talk about my job, I would tell them I love my job because I always have to go out. I don't have to be sitting down at a desk the whole day. And these past 4 months, I'm like, oh my God, I'm still sitting down at a desk. So I kind of got used to it already. But one of the things that I have learned, and it's really important, it's really interesting, is that all my interviews are over the phone. Like I want to say that probably 99% of my interviews are over the phone. And it's very interesting because I think that since then until now, I have been covering anything that I cover has something to do with COVID. So, but another thing that is really interesting is that when I talk to people, our community, mainly the people that get infected or have families that have been infected, they feel very comfortable talking with me. And sometimes I'm like, it's just on the phone. You don't even know me personally, but you are telling me all your story. You're explaining to me everything. So I feel that somehow, maybe because also of the language, because they speak Spanish and I start asking the questions. So I'm assuming that for them it's some kind of therapy, just to talk about their problem to somebody and explain how they got infected, how they realized, how was the deal at home, how they are overcoming the issue. So I think it's really nice. And for me, I feel very, very blessed, very lucky that people get to trust me, because sometimes, people ask you questions and you just feel offended. You're like, oh, I don't even want to answer this question because I don't know you. So when people start talking to me, it's really good. But then at the end, yeah, sometimes you feel a little bit bad, because when you are done, it's like, so what do I tell them now? Thank you, bye. So like, no, so I talked with them a little bit more, like a few more like questions, random questions, just so they don't feel that they're just being used. But because at the end of the day, their stories are very important. Every time that I write a story, there's always somebody that comes or emails me or calls me. And they're like, oh, you know what? I know this other person, situation similar than me. So it's really interesting, because I have realized that with time, we are journalists and our job is to write what we hear. But at the very same time, at this point, we're becoming some sort of therapist, the ones that just listen to the person, and the person talks and talks and talks. And then by the end of the conversation, they feel better. So I think that that's how it has helped for me to communicate with the Latino community. And I have been able to come up with really good stories thanks to that.
Right. Well, you're very lucky that you do get to stay home and be able to do your job from home, right? Which is, I think, one of the virtues of print, that you are able to some extent do it. It's probably a little bit more hard for the broadcasters who actually have to go out and shoot video, or in this case, radio, right, Leslie? So on your end, what are some of the things that you're having to contend with?
It's funny, listening to Jacqueline talking about working from home, because up until fairly recently, I was out in the field. I was the reporter with the microphone. I actually just became editor like the past year. There's a kind of survivor's guilt, honestly, at being home, because when the protests were happening, and as we know, we had a lot of unrest here in LA. we had a lot of our staff that was out there covering this, and there were people who were, you know, directly in danger. One of my colleagues, Adolfo Guzman Lopez, was shot in the throat with a rubber bullet. And yes, he was injured. And he's actually, he just came back, but, you know, we ran his first person story today, in fact, about that. Other reporters found themselves in difficult situations with guns pointed. It's been hard. It's been hard. I do, you know, kind of going back to, so actually we have had the DART Center come talk to us, because we have been dealing with trauma facing situations. Interestingly, you know, something I had mentioned in the planning of, you know, as we were planning this panel, I used to cover the border, you know, years ago, which was a very trauma facing job. We never talked about this stuff. We never talked about our feelings, which makes me very happy that we're having talks like this, that we are, because it is necessary. I mean, you know, we're not necessarily first responders, but in some cases, there can be similar effects depending on what we're covering, right? So I think it's really important that we talk about this. To the catharsis, I wanted to say one of the really cool things, especially from the community, as Jacqueline was saying, is I had been planning to start a series called Race in LA, which we just started, I don't know, probably about a month ago, back pegged to the census, you know, like in March, you know, and it was derailed by COVID, and we put it on hold. But after the unrest, we felt the time was right. And so people are now submitting, like just basically the general public is submitting its crowdsourced essays on lived experience with race and ethnicity. It's pretty cool. But the best thing about it is talking to people, because people just want to connect right now. They want to connect. And yes, you are a therapist. I mean, I have conversations with people that are submitting stuff, like sometimes just talking for an hour. It's the pandemic. It's the disparities in the pandemic. It's the disparities that they have felt their whole lives. It's everything. But there is this real need to connect right now. And I think as journalists, it's good to be tapping into that need to connect, because it's out there. People want to connect with each other.
Yeah, totally. And I would argue actually that journalists are first responders. You know, whenever I would go cover a wildfire, everybody was going this way, and only the journalists and the fire department and the cops were going that way. So
Totally.
We really are first responders, right? I mean, I've been at scenes where I'm there before the police is even there. So I think, you know, we'll get into this with Elana, but, you know, the journalists are in fact first responders. The bad thing is that we don't have the same training that real first responders have. That's a problem, and that's why we're doing this. So I just want to remind people that if you have a question at any time, you want to go ahead and put it in our chat, and then we will get to a Q&A section at the very end. But also, obviously, we want to have this conversation just to talk about it, right? The fact that we're even talking about this is a big deal. You know, we are acknowledging and addressing our feelings, which is super, super important. But the other thing that I want to make sure that we do, I want to make sure that we leave here, obviously, with some tips on how to, you know, make it all better, or at least, you know, make it somewhat better while you are struggling, you know, with your jobs and the coverage of what's happening. But also, one of the big reasons why I wanted to do this is because I think we all need to become more educated about the role of trauma in our jobs. And so I'm going to take a little bit detour to kind of get into some of this, because one of the things that concerns me, you know, in hindsight, now that hindsight is always 20/20, and now that I can look back and say, hey, I get it, this climate really concerns me, because the country is in pain, okay? Everyone is in anguish, whether it's because of the pandemic, because people are losing, you know, loved ones, friends. People are hurting economically. There's many businesses, you know, small business owners who did not receive any money. There's a lot of people that have not even been able to tap into unemployment. So this is all a very dangerous climate for reporting. You both have mentioned that you guys feel like you're therapists, which in many ways you kind of are, but there's a danger with that, okay? There is a danger with being exposed to the secondary trauma. And so that's one of the things that I want to get into now with Elana, so that she can explain a little bit, because oftentimes we think that we're going to go to Haiti and that we're going to see something gruesome and that might incite trauma. But that's not always the case. You know, we can in fact be exposed to trauma in our daily news life. And so, Elana, please explain for people the difference between direct trauma and secondary trauma and how we're exposed to that in something as what could have just been a simple assignment, you know, a daily assignment.
Sure. So direct trauma is something that you directly experience: being assaulted, being harassed, direct intimidation and threats, sexual harassment, which tends to happen within industry more than from outside industry, death knocks, having to go to the door. You all know what death knocks are. No, not death knocks. Let me take that back. Sorry. Sexual harassment and handling massive amounts of graphic imagery for those of you who are photographers or picture editors. Those are the direct things, right? Every day. And usually when we talk about trauma, it's something that is really about cruelty, death, threat to yourself. But the indirect secondary trauma is actually where the sort of field started with journalists, which is you are every day, you are witnessing, you are a professional witness. That is your job, and you are a professional witness to grief, to people in pain, to injury, to car accidents. And we often think about the war correspondents, or we think about the big disasters, but it's that daily diet of covering car accidents, covering the court. You are constantly documenting the experiences of people in pain and cruelty. And that's what we mean by secondary trauma. And in fact, the literature is really focused quite a bit on about, it varies, 80 to 100% of journalists at all ages, all parts of their career are exposed to this stuff. You're resilient in many ways, but you are vulnerable. And I think just as you were saying, some people like first on the scene rather than first responders. There's a debate there, but it's not been part of your training to sort of how do we deal with this every day. And I joke sometimes that when I train clinical students, we have them deal with their emotions so that they can be more objective when they collect information. So when I'm training a therapist, it's all about emotions. When I'm talking to journalists, we don't usually start talking about emotions till we start talking about audience presentation, and that having some emotional literacy might be really helpful in sort of centering yourself so that you can have that information and do the important work that you do, and you do such important work. I want to throw one other thing into here, which is a lot of people now are talking also about moral injury. And it's an idea that's come from, it's a term that they're using a lot in the military, but people are starting to talk about it with journalists. So the idea of moral injury is this idea that you are either perpetrating, in the case of military, or failing to prevent or bearing witness to horrible acts and transgressions that really shake you to your core. And it might not actually end up in more of a psychiatric problem or symptoms kind of problem, but a spiritual problem. And as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about this, and there's starting to be some studies of journalists that we are in a position, and I'm assuming most of you, that where many of you are covering things that I think are morally treacherous. And while moral outreach can help you tell better stories, it also may be adding to the impact here. So there's just some concepts: direct, indirect, and moral.
Right, right. So what she said is super important. Like, we've all heard that expression, I can feel your pain. Well, you actually can feel the person's pain. So, when we go out and we interview people and we really hear a soundbite that's like, oh my God, I really felt that. That we need to be careful about that, because if you felt it, you literally felt it. And look, we're all guilty, right? Like, I know I was guilty of going out on stories, and I always joked, I always said, I could probably make anyone cry. Like, I really could. And I almost saw that as a badge of honor. Like, I'm such a good interviewer that I could probably make anyone cry. But what I wasn't realizing is that was actually exposing me to secondary trauma. That person was projecting their pain on me. And so whenever you're out in the field and you are just covering what you think is a regular story, and suddenly you're excited because someone begins to cry and you say, oh my God, this is going to be a great soundbite, or oh, this is going to be great color for my print story. Ojo, this is where you got to be careful, because in that moment, that person took their pain and projected it onto you. And yeah, it's not direct trauma, but over time, you know, it's like a filing cabinet. You kind of put it in there, and over time, there's nothing more to, you can't file anything more. And so, you know, this is sort of kind of some of the things that can become insidious if we're not careful, right? So, so we got to be careful. So I'll rope in Jacqueline and Leslie in a second, but one more thing that I wanted to address with you, Elana. What are some of the warning signs? What are some, because we go out, we do this work, we act as therapists, but we never take the time to address this emotional distress that we feel from the people we interview, right? We just violate, or we insulate ourselves. And I mean, realistically, we probably should be addressing it and getting to it. But the truth is we never do. So if it gets to the point where it becomes an issue, what are some of the warning signs that we're looking out for that maybe it's time to take a more active role in becoming better about addressing our emotional health?
Before I talk about warning signs, I want to push back a little bit in the idea that you're therapists. I think when you're telling a story, the goals are very different. A therapist's goal is to help the person. Your job is to tell a story accurately and sensitively, and they're very different aims. I think that it is true that you share the communication, and in that way, and that sometimes it can be therapeutic for someone to talk to you, and that there should be great pride that it is beneficial to sources to have their stories told. But I want to push back on the idea that you're a therapist, because you're not. So I just wanted to say that. So before, I just wanted to push back, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but I do think you do serve, as Leslie was saying, as an important way of creating community, and creating community is a way, I think, to actually be resilient. But we'll get to there. So warning signs, and you probably can speak to this yourself about warning signs, but I think we all know ourselves. But warning signs are when you start doing things that show that you're really stressed. And at a lower level, you know, we all have our tell signs. I lose my keys. We all know when we're stressed. We all have a tell sign of what happens, right? You yell a little bit more at your family members, you're more irritable. The times that I would start to worry, or the big red flags, are when you're really depressed, when you really don't feel like you can do your job, when you're starting to think, oh, life would be better off if I weren't here. If you're self-medicating and it's getting in your way, there's nothing wrong with a little self-medication. But if it's really getting in your way, and if you're avoiding doing your work, I think those are all big red flags, like, oh, I really need help. But the hope is, and we can talk about it, is that if you can recognize your signs a little earlier, that you can turn them into situations. Because we are going to have stress. You can't get rid of stress. It's normative. We're going to have reactions. It's just how you handle those reactions. And again, that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation. The DART Center started 21 years ago, yet it's really, the stigma is changing. And I think it's really important that the stigma continue to, we get rid of it. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. And maybe you can talk about your own experience about those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'll talk about my experience in a second, but I want to rope in Jacqueline and Leslie. Obviously, we don't want to get it to the point where you're experiencing anxiety and depression and having panic attacks. I can tell you, you know, that I've had colleagues of mine at ABC News. I have one colleague who actually had a full-blown panic attack on live TV, and if you Google it, it's still out there. You can see it, and so right, it can get bad. Obviously, we don't want it to get to that point, but obviously, if you start experiencing insomnia, if you start experiencing, you know, just stressors, or if you start like, oh, I don't want to go to work, I don't want to go to work, that's a sign, right? But let me rope in Jacqueline and Leslie. Have either of you experienced, like maybe Leslie, you said when you go to the border, you've had instances where it was difficult. Maybe you even saw people being arrested or deported, or, you know, we've seen parents who have been ripped apart from their children. That can't be easy to witness. How have you experienced this in your own reporting?
All of the above. I was covering the border during the mid-2000s. I was there for about, 7 years. And this is a time where you had a lot of people dying. And this was before, you remember there was a fence built in the San Diego area in the mid-90s. And by the early 2000s, you had people that were moving into the Imperial Valley Desert. You had people that were moving into Arizona then. So I saw death. I saw death. I saw a lot of pain. I actually will never leave me. I remember going with the coroner and meeting the Border Patrol at a remote spot and picking up a woman who, her body, who was my age. And it just it never left me. It never left me. I would bring this stuff home with me. I would bring the tension home with me. I would have dreams about it. It would, and it just kind of continued. There were other instances, and because you do build these relationships, right? There was this another long-term series of stories that I did where there had been a wildfire on the border. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but in the San Diego area, there was a wildfire that actually hit like the very border and actually caught people who were crossing in the flames, and people were killed. And there was the father of a young woman who didn't want her to leave. She had left with her husband, and she had disappeared. And he got a humanitarian visa. I met him at Tijuana. That was the beginning of the relationship. We walked up to the line, at the consulate, and, said, good luck, call me when you get to the other side. He did. He got his humanitarian visa, and he was there to hunt for answers. And he was here for a month until he got the answer, which was a very bad answer. So it kind of telling that and getting to know this man. At the time, I was a new mom. I was a new parent. Living the agony of this parent at the time was very, very difficult for me. I did take it home. So yeah, I'll stop hogging the mic, but you do take that stuff home with you. It was not a time in the mid-2000s where you would go and talk to your editor about how this was hurting. You wouldn't. You would just keep going. But you would cry the tears alone, pretty much. But yeah, that stuff really, really sticks with you.
Yeah. And in a second, I'm going to get into that, because obviously, every company always tells you, oh, speak up, let us know, safety first. But in reality, we kind of know that they just have to cover their butts and then really kind of don't mean it sometimes. So we're going to get into that in a second. But let me ask Jacqueline, is there something that has stuck to you or that tugged at your heart, something that was difficult to cover for you?
Yes, I want to mention more specifically on when I was talking earlier about the therapy part, being a therapist. I think that in a way I find it really interesting, just because for us Latinos, they always, the first thing before being a professional or whatever, they teach us from when we are little to be polite, right? Like, don't interrupt, just listen, pay attention. So like right now when I listen to people and they tell me their stories, I just feel that it would be very rude just to be like, okay, you already answered my question, bye. So that's why I try to stay a little longer and listen. But yes, it's true, sometimes the situation gets very, very, very sad or tense, or, and yes, you do get to have that. Right now at home, what I tend to do a lot is, like, when my husband gets from work, I just talk to him about my stories. And then he kind of listens to my stories. But what I would do before, when I was on the field and I would go and cover stories, and it's really interesting because, like what you mentioned earlier, Jesus, about covering a car accident. And then, like, you have to go and put the microphone to the dad who just lost the 2 children. And then you have to ask him, how does he feel? So that's horrendous. That's horrible. So when things like that happen to me, what I do, like, seriously, I just go in my car and then if I feel tears that they have to come out of my eyes, I just let them go, because, like, sometimes I feel that it's worse when you keep them to yourself. So I just feel a little more relief when I just, like, if I have to cry, I cry as I'm driving to whatever I'm driving, once I'm done with the interviews, because it's the very next moment to the pain. And like what Jesus said, so this is something very, very important. And it's like the interview is telling you, like, they're pretty much pouring their heart on you. So yes, so you do tend to take that a little bit of that. So, and Another thing that I do want to mention, prior to working as a journalist full-time, I was working as a video editor for a therapy company, which is really interesting because right there I learned a lot about being a coffee therapist. And many times, many of us are that, and we don't even realize that we're coffee therapists. When our friends come to us and they're talking for 2 hours, and then you're just listening. And even if you give advice, they don't listen to you, but they just feel good that they talk to you. Or you do the same thing. You go to your friends and you talk and they tell you whatever and you don't listen, but it just feels good. So, and somehow I think that when we talk to our interviewees and we let them talk, we become kind of coffee therapists. But this time it's like phone therapist.
Right. Totally. Obviously, I could sit here and talk about experiences for hours, but the one thing that I would touch upon that I think is very important for people is if you ever feel like you get to a point where you're numbing, and numbing can happen in many ways. Numbing can happen if you're just not reacting properly to something. So in my case, I actually numbed a lot and I didn't realize it. So, I was at a big network. I was getting sent on like the big stories that everyone wanted to be on, right? And then once you start traveling internationally and you're getting to go to like Haiti and Chile and these big places, that's the whole point. That's why you've trained. That's why you've kind of worked the overnight shift and paid your dues to go on those big stories. But I was there for many, many years, and it got to the point where in order to do my job properly, I just had to become a robot, right? And I justified by saying like, well, this is probably what doctors do, right? Like you watch them on television and they're able to just kind of be stone cold and go into the operating room and have no feeling. And so for me, I thought that's what you were supposed to do. That's not what you're supposed to do, but I thought that's what you were supposed to do because it's what allowed me to do my job, right? And so I think one big warning sign that I would say is if you're out in Haiti and you're seeing hundreds, if not thousands of people dead, the normal reaction is to want to cry or to feel like some sort of pain or anguish. If you are a robot and you're not feeling that, that is a huge warning sign. And you need to take the time to address it, probably with a therapist, which is something that I should have done, but I didn't. And then also, look, we all know a lot of journalists drink. And, we drink because we think we're being social. Clarification, I've never been an alcoholic, so I don't want my students watching this to ask me later. But no, but right, that's something that we do as journalists. Oh, let's go for a drink. But if it becomes an issue, then, that's not a good sign either. And then the last thing that I would say is, sadly, we work in an industry that rewards us for doing this. So I always figured, well, of course I want to go to Haiti because if I go to Haiti, I can win an Emmy. Like, I'm not going to win an Emmy, like, covering, I don't know, like, the city council, right? So so then it's insidious because, then those are the big stories that are rewarded with Pulitzers and Emmys and Hearst Awards, right? So it's just overall a recipe for disaster. And this is where we really need to take a conscious effort and work on our health ourselves. I will never forget this, but I had one editor one time when he wanted me to drive to a tornado in the middle of the night. And for those of you who haven't covered tornadoes, bad idea because you can't see the tornadoes at night. So I objected. I said, no, why would I do that? And I will never forget what he said. He said, kiddo, my job is to ask you to go. It's your job to protect yourself. So remember that. It's not your editor's job to protect you. It's not your boss's job to protect you. Their job is to ask you if you can do something. The only person that's going to protect yourself is you. So with that said, and I know we took a huge detour in covering trauma, but I think it was important for us to become educated about, how we, are exposed to trauma in the day in and day out of what we do. But now I want to get to like some of the helpful stuff, like, right? I mean, now fast forwarding to COVID again, right? I mean, it's a hard time. It's not a tornado. It's not Haiti, but it's difficult, you know, especially in the Latino community. We know that it's that more Latinos and African Americans are dying as a result of COVID. It's hitting us harder economically. So it's a tough time out there. But I want to get into some of the tips. So let's go to Leslie. What are some of your self-care tips? What have you discovered that helps you to decompress or to stay connected and not feel lonely? What types of things are you doing?
Family time. Family time is the best thing. It just reconnects you. It reconnects you to like what is important. I mean, there's so much of this. It's all important, right? But just, you know, that really helps. Whether it's, you know, just sort of hugging my daughter, calling my parents, that really helps. It's very, very grounding, I think. And yeah, sometimes it's tempting to not turn off the computer. I could be working all night if I wanted to. I tell myself, stop. If you can do this tomorrow morning, you can do it tomorrow morning. Set the alarm early, but sometimes you just have to give yourself, because if you're working until you're going to go to sleep, you're not going to go to sleep.
Right, right. You mentioned family time, but I really worry for the people that are single, because those are the people that are sort of having to deal with this alone, which really sucks, right? So Jacqueline, I know you have family too, so I won't ask you, but let me ask Elana, for the people that are single and that aren't able to connect, what can they do?
So, well, first of all, I think everybody can connect. It's just a matter of how you connect.
In person.
So, in person, right. So we really can. I think that what you're saying is that one has to actively create community. And however you can do that, whether it's dancing with people via the computer, whether it's reaching out to friends on the phone, but that we all need to be part of the community. And I think the other part that Leslie said is thinking about your work as connecting to the community. And actually, Jacqueline, you said that too. Your work itself is important in a way of connecting. And then the other thing I would say is that giving support to other people, you know, going to your colleagues and saying, you did a great job on that story. It turns out that it's not just receiving support, but it's giving support that keeps people resilient. And you can be a great colleague. And that's a way of also reaching out to other people, but also in your personal life. So I think that that's really important is any way you can create community and being active, writing it down. I try once a day. I am single. I try once a day, and I'm not a reporter, but I once a day reach out to someone. And I know I need to do that because I've been living alone for how many months? Barely seeing anybody. I make it an active part of what I do each day.
Right. Let me rope in Jacqueline. Jacqueline, we're workaholics. So if someone doesn't stop us, we're going to keep the computer open. And especially because we're not doing much right now. So we figure, oh, well, might as well be productive. But that's not good, right? So you were telling me earlier that it's very important for you to create boundaries, especially because you're working from home. So how have you created those boundaries so that you're not constantly consumed by the work?
Yes, definitely. I have to force myself. I have an office here at home. So what I do is as soon as I'm done with my job, I turn off the computer and I leave the office. And that's what I do because I know that if I stay a little bit longer, it becomes like an hour or two. And then you don't even realize when it's already 9 o'clock, time to go to bed. So what I try to do, and I have become this more like a habit since the pandemic started, I try to turn off my computer before 5 p.m. And then by 5 I'm done. And then I always try to go for a walk to the park because we cannot do much, but with the little things that we can do. So we try to do that. I have 2 dogs. Now we understand a lot that phrase in Spanish that we used to say a lot. Tienes un perro que te ladre? So like, yes, I have a dog, 2 dogs that bark at me and I have to take them out and take them for a walk. So that helps a lot. So I think that when you have like, these little things to do, but that they become very, very good on yourself. Like just go out for a walk, like go with my husband, go with my dogs. That helps a lot. And I think that somehow I have been coping with that. And other than that, I just definitely, I just try to stay out of my computer. If I really have to work, then I leave at 5 and then probably I come back like at 7 or 8 if I have to do something else. And then I just work for an hour. But other than that, I definitely tried. And it's really hard, like you said, because when you have an office, you know that you can go and close your door and nobody's going to be bugging you. But I really try to force myself to stay away from my office when it's not working hours.
Right. So here are some tips that I found. I'm going to read some. And if I miss anything or if you want to add anything, Elana, please do so. But but it's very important for everybody to take breaks. And even if you're on deadline, even like a nano break, 1 minute or 30 seconds, that's better than nothing. You got to decompress in any way that's safe. So look, there are restaurants that are open. So you are able to go out, you are able to take a hike, right? Exercise is really important. So we know that nature is very calming. So go on a hike, go to the beach. If you're worried about these places being crowded, wake up at 6 in the morning. I can tell you there's nobody at the beach at 6 in the morning. So there are ways to do it. Try to do activities that you normally enjoy. Okay, whatever that is, you know, yoga or meditation. Oh my God, I wish I would have discovered yoga or meditation way, way earlier. In fact, I actually had colleagues who invited me to a yoga class like 20 years ago, and I hated it. I even told them, this is the stupidest like exercise ever. Like, I don't get it. Like, I could have like just gone for like a jog and burned more calories. What I didn't realize is that yoga is not so much about the exercise. It's about controlling the stress and really learning to be in the present. So if you're gonna try yoga, if you've never have, I highly recommend it, but you gotta be in the right frame of mind and realize that it's more a stress control than it is a workout, although you will get a workout too. Obviously, learning how to breathe correctly, you know, that's why yoga is so successful. Super important, get plenty of sleep. We know that the people that are getting anxiety the most is because they don't sleep well. You know, not sleeping well will lead to irritability. If you're irritated, then it's easier to feel like things are falling apart, which is what usually a panic attack feels like. So it starts with sleeping. If you're not sleeping properly, you need to nip it in the butt, because we have all been there where, oh, I'm fine on 4 hours. Oh, I'm fine on 5. Not healthy. All right. We've talked about connecting to others. And then the last one that I have on my list, and then Elana can add any if I missed any, avoid too much exposure to the news, which is hard because we're journalists and we feel like if we're not constantly on Twitter, we're missing an angle or we're missing something. So those are some of the ones I found. Is there anything else, Elana, that you think is important?
Things.
Okay, sure.
And part of it is not just, you can't avoid the news, but think about when you watch the news. Sometimes I say no bedlam before bed. So
right.
Probably not watching the news right before you're going to sleep, but you do need to watch it thinking about what times of the day, being conscious of it. Rituals, any kind of rituals. Jacqueline's talked about being able to leave her office. Some people don't have offices. So there are rituals you can do at the end of your day to create a boundary. I've heard journalists who live in one-room apartments talk about covering their computer, but then they want to use it for Netflix. So lighting a candle at the end of the day. Just making a list of what you need to still do. Having some kind of ritual that ends your day, taking a shower, that just helps you separate the day. Remembering the purpose and meaning of what you do. Doing anything that will, doing something fun, anything that will make you get away from work. And then I just want to mention a couple things for sleep. It's always hard because sleep sort of is a cycle. Trying to go to sleep at the same time each night can help you over time. Getting a sleep routine and having a routine for rituals is one way to help start regulating your sleep, because it is, those of you who are parents know what it's like when you're sleep deprived. So just trying to get into a routine about sleep and having a ritual for sleep can help build better sleep habits. And then I guess the other thing I would say also, for those of you, you talked about being outside, transcendence, spirituality, faith, religion, whatever it is, having some sense of that, some sense of greater purpose, however you see that, is something that's important. And finding the humor in things gives you perspective. So right. I think those are all some tips.
Got it. I'm going to add 2 more things and then we'll move on. Also, we're going to make available, some of the tips, we're going to make them available online. You wanted to say something, Jacqueline?
Yes, let me add something really quickly that I forgot to mention earlier. Every time that I want to feel desperate or frustrated or whatever about the fact of being enclosed, I just think about one thing. A lot of people don't have jobs right now. So we are very lucky to have a job right now, even if we have to do it from home. So when I start thinking about that, then I just forget the rest.
Yes. Two things that one of them was mentioned in the chat, and I completely agree. But two things that I think are helpful. One, this one came from my therapist actually. So that you're not a nervous Nelly and constantly worrying. Obviously, we all worry about things like, right? Maybe we're one of those journalists who don't have a job, so we're gonna worry. But I was told to designate an hour as your worry hour. So there are 24 hours in the day. If you designate 1 hour and you say, hey, I'm only gonna worry from 11 to 12, then in that 1 hour, you unleash everything you have to unleash and you go for it. You write a list or you cuss, you scream, you do whatever you gotta do. But once 12 comes around, your worry hour is over, and then that's it. You don't get to worry until the next day at that hour. So I found that very helpful. And then someone said this in the chat, completely agree. Just learn to say no. Learn that it's okay to say no. We don't have to be overachievers all the time. You know, if you're overextended, don't say yes just for the sake of saying yes. Like, it's okay to say no. So that's a big one. All right, I wanna move on just because we are running out of time. In about 5 or 7 minutes, we're gonna start answering some of your questions. So if you have them, please post them in the chat. We'll get to those shortly. But I wanna switch gears just because I think some of the stuff we're gonna get into is super important, and I'm gonna rope you in, Leslie. But earlier we were talking about how, you know, it's so important to be able to talk with your boss, you know, and many of us, I think it remained taboo, a taboo topic, because we were afraid to say, hey boss, this is actually like, you know, causing me issues, because I don't want to speak up and then suddenly I'm like the weak guy that had an issue in Haiti and then they don't want to send me overseas anymore. So then we keep it to ourselves. But as someone who now manages people, how important is it to have these conversations with your boss? And how are you able to do it in such a way that you don't feel like you're being judged for it or punished for it?
I think it's just important to do it. I think just have a voice, you know? I mean, I think the climate, you know, depends on the newsroom that everybody works in, but I think the climate has changed. And I think if you tell your boss, like, look, you know what, I'm really tired, I need a day off. Can I take a day off this week? It's okay, it's all right. I mean, right now we're already learning to work. Like I said earlier, we're learning to do a lot with very little, because some of us, we all have furloughs now, right? So everybody's like furloughed a half day a week. We're doing a lot with less. And so we're trying to work around that stuff. And people have had to take time off. People have had to take time off to take care of kids, to, you know, take care of family, you know? And so it's, you know, fortunately it's not 15 years ago, fortunately it's today. And we can have these conversations. So yes, bring it up, ask. If you've just been working, you know, like nonstop the past week and you need to take a half a day or a morning, bring it up. You know, you might actually get a yes.
Yeah. Well, you're a good boss, because I can tell you that I would not have had the balls to tell my boss. Like he would have totally judged me, and he would, you know, have a different feeling. So that's great. It's great to know that, you know, that's how you feel. How about you, Jacqueline? Do you feel like this is something that you can be honest with, or do you feel like you would be looked at sideways if you spoke about it?
I think with us works a little bit different from the beginning, because since I started working on Opinion, and I think way before that, we would rarely go to the office. Rarely. We just commuted to whatever we have to go do our interviews. Then we just write our stories, send them, and that's it. So I would probably see my boss and my editors maybe like, I want to say every 3 months or so. So by the time when you see them, you already forgot what you were gonna say, so then you just move on. So, but if there was any time that I wanted to talk to my boss, he's an Argentinian guy, really, really nice. So I felt that very comfortable if I wanted to tell something to him. There was also a time when the reporters, like a few times, like we would be like, hey, let's hang out this day, because I would not even see my coworkers. So I mean, at the end of the day, like it's also a kind of like a lonely job where you don't have all these coworkers that you can hang out with unless you really make time for it. So I kind of got used to it. I didn't see it as anything bad, but it's like more like I'm telling you, for me, instead of relying like on my boss to see like whether I can take the day off or not, you just literally take the day off. Like I'm not gonna come to work this day and that's it. So right. That's more what you do.
Elana, roping you in, if we have a news manager watching this and they wanna, be more inclusive. They want to do what's right. How can a manager, a newsroom manager, do a better job of supporting journalists, cope through this?
And I think that news managers are changing, and that more and more news managers are invested in the occupational health journalists, because if people are healthy, they do better storytelling. So I think that it is changing quite a bit. So I think that it's really important for editors to be checking in regularly, and it depends on the kind. If they're constantly assigning you really tough stories, to be asking folks how they're doing, to set a role model for boundaries, to set role models for having these conversations. The other part is just having trainings. One of you mentioned that, having trainings in the newsroom, bringing these issues up, creating those kinds of opportunities. And then finally, I do think that healthcare, and that includes mental health care, needs to be available for all people. And that's an important thing that we can work on both for journalists, is just having access to healthcare.
Okay. Again, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. We're going to get to those in a second. So just to wrap up, 2 more questions for either Leslie or Jacqueline. So actually, Leslie, you mentioned that it's important to realize when you need to take time off. So Jacqueline, do you feel like you can take time off whenever you want, or is it tricky? What are some of your tips for people that feel like, oh my God, I'm overdue for a vacation, but there's layoffs. I don't want to be one, I want to keep going because I want to make sure they know I'm a good employee. How do you balance being a team player and being a good journalist and being, a good everything, but also realizing that you're overdue for a break?
Yeah, I think this year is going to be the only one that is going to be really weird, because of the past years, like at my work, they know that in September, those are my vacations, period. So, I mean, you try to make it sure that, at this time, I have other coworkers that they take the time off on Christmas or New Year's. And I really don't mind working for New Year's. I actually love to work for New Year's. So, but I think if you have the days off or the time off, then you should ask for it, because at the end of the day, your mental health is very important. And one of the things, and this is by law, if we have vacations, we can take them. We can use them at any time, as long as we ask for permission. And yes, probably it's gonna be something like, they're gonna think that I just want to be taking vacations all the time. But you didn't make up the day. You didn't make up like when are you, how many vacations you're gonna get. It's like you got those days. So if you haven't used them, if you really think that you need them, if you don't and you just want to take the day off because you just want to take the day off, then I mean, that's different. But many times, I mean, like, yes, we come from covering like really, really tough stories, and then probably you do feel that you need some time off. So yes, I would totally say if you have that days, take them off. If you are a freelancer, because many times works for freelancers, so I know that it's very different. You just turn in your story and then you can do whatever you want the next day. So definitely it works depending on what type of employee you are.
Definitely. Again, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat, because I will get to answering those in a second. Even if it's about anything, really. I mean, if you want us to elaborate on our experience, if you want us to, maybe we went through something too fast and you want us to elaborate, we have an extra 45 minutes to talk, go through your questions. So please let us know what's on your mind. To wrap our portion up, I want to pose this to all of you, but obviously one of the things that we coincide on is that it's very important to just talk, right? We need to get it out. We can't go back to the old days where journalists just internalized everything and felt like they would be judged or reprimanded if they were having an issue with a story that they were covering. So how can we as journalists do a better job of creating, a community between our colleagues or between other journalists, maybe through NAHJ or one of the other organizations, that allows us to talk? Obviously you mentioned, Leslie, or I think it was Jacqueline, that you talk a lot to your husband, right? But your husband may not know what it's like to be in the field. So it sometimes really requires another journalist to understand like the idiosyncrasies that we face out in the field. So maybe let me go to Elana first, and then Leslie and Jacqueline can jump in if you want. But how can we create those communities that would allow us to address some of these issues?
Well, I'll start by saying you've just done it by having this session. So that's a first start,
Yay.
is having this conversation. But I think continuing this conversation. So having coffee or having a happy hour, creating opportunities at your work site to have it within your professional organizations. We have a tip sheet on how to be a good colleague as well. And you can get very formal, and many newsrooms have created peer support programs that are more formal, and you can do it informally. Sometimes you just reach out to someone if you think that story and you read it and you're like, oh my God, that must have been so hard for that person. Just calling up someone saying, wow, that was an amazing story. How are you doing? So I think just doing the kinds of things that you all do, and it can get more formal than that, but I think that's important, just to do it and to have these conversations at your professional societies with your students. I think that's changed a lot.
Yes.
With students, this was never talked about before in the classroom, and now emotional literacy, trauma coverage, how to take care of yourself, that's all becoming part of it. We're just doing a study now where what we've discovered is that although journalists, educators think self-care is important, it's the hardest thing for even educators to talk about. So continuing to talk about these and breaking through the stigma, I think, is really important. And I'll be quiet now.
No, this is all great. This is all great. How about you, Leslie and Jacqueline? Any thoughts about how we can create, aside from what we just did, which is amazing, you know, within your newsrooms, how can you take this and expand it in your newsrooms?
I think we have to push ourselves a little bit, right? I mean, before this pandemic, I had a group of in real life colleagues who we would have in real life gatherings. You know, we would, you know, get together for dinner, we would get together for barbecues, we would talk, we would have drinks. We don't do that now, and no one has time for virtual happy hours because at the end of the day, we're exhausted. So we just have to pick up the phone sometimes and just make ourselves talk to people, even if it at lunchtime, whenever. I mean, we use Slack sometimes, like we'll be like venting on Slack and connecting with each other, but sometimes not related to assignments, just like we'll say something funny to each other, just something to make you feel like there's another human being out there who kind of gets you. You know, it's really important. I mentioned my friend who was injured, you know, earlier in the talk, who was injured during a protest. And, you know, a couple of weeks after he'd been home recovering, I said, how would you feel if I came and sat in your yard with you, you know? And so, yeah, I did, you know, came in, you know, wore a mask, brought a flan, he made cafecito. We talked for like 3 hours. And it was good for me and it was good for him too, you know, because he'd been talking to his family about this, but not really in person to a colleague, you know? So we need to push ourselves to make that time. And I realize that it's hard, but I think that, you know, yes, sometimes the only person who's going to really get a journalist is another journalist. So we have to make sure we have these conversations that we don't lose our communities.
Perfect, perfect. You were going to say something, Jacqueline?
Yeah, no, yeah, I just totally agree with what Leslie said completely. Like for us before the pandemic, we would also do that. Like I mentioned, I would get together with, sometimes you cannot do it all the time, but sometimes. Right now it's a little bit harder, but yes, hopefully eventually once this is over, and we're going to have so many things to talk about.
Yeah, totally. All right, so I want to get into some of your questions. We have about 30 minutes to answer some, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Elana, someone mentioned, how do you make the time? And I think they're referring to the fact that I was mentioning that sometimes where you're at on a story, you kind of put it in the to-do file, but you never really get back to it. So, you know, one thing that probably people don't realize is that real first responders, like the cops, the fire department, all these people that respond to very tragic situations, like let's say if a cop goes to a mass shooting, before that cop can go back to work, they have to go through a therapist that's going to make sure that they are released back to work. So they're forced to talk about it. And so I can tell you in journalism, that doesn't happen with us, right? We probably get one day off and then we're rewarded with another story. Oh, you did fantastic. Here's another story, go. So obviously, you know, making the time is hard for us. So what are some tips? Like, how do we make the time so that it doesn't get bad?
So just like when you prepare for a story, you make sure your equipment's, if your photographer is in place, you make sure you have something to record. If it's not breaking news, you're going to make sure that you do a little background. What we at the Dart Center is to talk about is having a before, during, and after plan. That just like if you were going to go into a hostile environment, you would be thinking about, what do I need to do to prep? What do I need to be safe during? And then what can I do after? I would really encourage folks to think about that emotionally. What do I need to do before? Like, can I manage this right now? What do I need to do during? Is it taking a breath? Is it, checking that something's been done? Is it focusing on the story right then and there? And then what do I need to do after? Is that it becomes part of your work. And yes, we all want to be perfect. We all don't have perfect mental health. We're all going to be stressed. We're all going to have emotions. But really trying to think about, okay, what is it that I can do that keeps me functioning the best I can? And I think that's really important. Taking one breath isn't going to take all your time, or counting the numbers of blue things for 1 minute while you sort of get your sense is all helpful. So that there are lots of little tips you can do. Yes, it would be great if we said, oh, we're going to do yoga and exercise every day, and we're going to do all of it. None of us are going to be able to do that. But what are the things you can do in 1 minute? What are the things you can do in 3 minutes? What are the things you can do in 5 minutes? What are the things you can do in an hour each day? And really trying to come into some habits. And it's just a habit. It's a habit of trying to find time to do a few things that help you take care of yourself. And you know yourself best as to the kinds of things that'll help you.
Okay. One follow-up for Elana. So what happens when you see a red flag? So let's say we've gone through the motions and we're like, oh, something's off. Is this something that we can deal with on our own, or how do we know that it's time to see a therapist? And how do we go about seeing a therapist?
So the answer is it depends. But I'll start with saying that the first thing I usually ask people to think about is, what has gotten you through a rough time before? We can all think back to a rough period we've had. What was helpful that you did? Do more of that. And what was not so good that you did? Do less of that. That's the first approach. Try that. If that doesn't work, then the next thing to do is say, okay, is there something else I need help with? You can try and talk to a friend. You can try and talk to a colleague. And if at that point you're still stuck and it's a problem, then it's time to seek help. Now, those of you who are lucky enough to have the jobs that offer mental health care, you can go through it that way. We have a full sheet on how to find a therapist, the one that's trauma sensitive and understands journalists. I won't go into that now, but we'll be able to, I think that sheet will be provided. If you are suicidal, however, that is a point where you should, or homicidal, you want to hurt somebody. If you really want to hurt somebody or yourself, then you should immediately seek help at an emergency room. And that's that phase of it. But short of that, try what's worked before. And if you're hitting roadblocks, then it's time you may need a boost.
Right. I've encountered people who have said, hey, I'm struggling a little bit. Do you know any supplements I can take? And for me, that's a warning sign. Like if it's already at the point where you feel like you need a medication for it, then it's probably time to see a doctor or a therapist, right? Because, you shouldn't be self-medicating, and, who knows what you're putting in your body. Like, I mean, it's gotten to the point where you probably should be kind of, seeking professional help. Leslie, question for Leslie. Can you talk more about survivor's guilt? As someone who used to be out in the field and now behind the desk as a content editor, it feels like I'm not doing enough. Like Jesus mentioned, it's an accumulation of trying to ensure we get to all the stories.
Oh, yes. I don't know how many times I've been like, okay, I'm gonna go do it. And it's like, wait, it's not my job now. And especially as, we were having reporters go out into these protests where there were some dicey situations, somebody got hurt, some other people got threatened. Yeah, I did feel like, wow, I'm very protected here. So there was kind of a feeling of survivor's guilt as somebody who was until recently in the field. I should mention the survivor's guilt is something, I don't know if anybody else feels it. It's something that I have felt before, even in my job. I mean, because I used to work on the border, I would kind of cross back and forth. Oftentimes I would do stories, on the south side, come back to the north side. And I would, sometimes look at my American passport and think, freaking lucky, and why isn't everybody else? And you do get survivor's guilt from that too. So there are different kinds of survivor's guilt, I guess I'm talking about. But yeah, how do I best deal with it is just, trying to be there and trying to be a human being, I guess. you know, as I'm dealing with the folks that are out in the field, you know, because I mean, it's all very close still, I guess. But you know what I should say, then that's one thing that actually, you know, is really helpful, is having been close to it until recently. That actually kind of helps. It helps a lot. I mean, and you might get survivor's guilt, but it helps me understand what they're dealing with as well.
Right. And I think, you know, if you're having survivor's guilt, that is kind of a good sign. It means that you're still reacting, you know, in a normal way to a story. Like I mentioned earlier, if it gets to the point where you're so numbed or so insulated that you're not having that normal reaction and you're kind of just like a robot and, oh, I can go here and I can go here. That's more insidious. And so having that survivor's guilt in a way is kind of a good sign. You know, it means that you are still reacting adequately, I think.
Can I say something about
Yeah, of
survivor's
course.
guilt?
Yeah,
I
of course.
think that it's really important to monitor, because it's one of those things, and I think particularly for persons of color, for Hispanic, that this issue of feeling privileged at the same time you're telling stories about not privilege, it's a complicated set of issues. And I think, again, focusing on what you can do as journalists and why your work is so important, I think can be a way of addressing this. Yes, you may not be able to do this, but you may be able to do this. The other thing that we found in a lot of our research is that people who have ethical regrets tend to have more difficulties, and about ethics about journalism. So I guess the other part I would say is that doing your job ethically is in really some way a protective factor. And I wanted to just say that it is related to guilt about stories as well. And that I do think more conversations about ethics and guilt are important, because it is hard to tell stories from a point of privilege. And that's just the reality. And so remembering why you tell those stories and the differences you can make can really be, I think, important.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. No, that's really good. No, because I just to back up, you know, I mean, anybody who's ever kind of like, you know, been doing some news gathering and storytelling in a place where people are struggling, and then you get back on the plane and you leave it behind, you really do feel that. And especially if it's a part of the world that you came from or that your family came from, you really do feel that sense of privilege. I think I would always comfort myself saying, well, at least now I'm in a position where I can give them a voice, right? And then that always made me feel better.
And you are the voice to the voiceless.
I also want to add something to this, and I think it's really important for all of us to know, the ones that are in journalism, that this is a very tough job, and not everybody is made up for this job. And I remember this from the moment that we were going to school. You had to know that if they were going to send you to do a story, you had to talk to strangers, you had to come up with sound bites, you had to come with interviews. And if you were shy, you knew that you were not made up for that. At this point, I have been in journalism for over 10 years, and I can still say that I love my job, and I love it a lot. So another thing that happens, I know a lot of my friends, former classmates, and other people, that they just didn't stay in journalism, and that's nothing bad with that, nothing wrong with that. They chose and they decided that there were some careers that were better for them. So one thing that I would say is that sometimes, not always it's about surviving, it's about liking what you do. And maybe if you feel that you're being kind of like being pushed too much, or you're kind of suffering at your work, or maybe it's like time to rethink if like you are doing the right thing, if you're really where you were supposed to be. Maybe you can explore other things, maybe you can see that there's something that is going to make you happy. Remember, at the end of the day, we have to work on jobs that make us happy, because if not, then we're just going to be miserable.
Yeah, I mean, look at me. I'm not a journalist anymore, right? Because I had my fair share. I mean, after 16 years of going on really difficult stories, I had enough, and I didn't want to do that for my rest of my life. But it took a lot of courage to walk away from it, and it's okay. I mean, I think the first year was hard because I felt out of place. But you know, now I'm at a place where I'm helping students, and I'm still being able to apply what I've learned, you know, throughout the years to make them better and to coach them. So, I mean, there are definitely second chapters and third chapters, and you know, if your body and your mind, more importantly, are telling you it's time, then it's time, and you can walk away with dignity. It doesn't have to be like this horrible exit where you feel embarrassed because you left. Like, who cares if I left, you know? And also, like, look, I will say this, especially like if you're in mainstream media, we know that the people of color get overworked. And it's absolutely true. I can tell you that in 1 year, I got sent to 12 wildfires while other colleagues were sent to 1. Why? Because, you know, the people of color end up being the workhorses, and suddenly we're supposed to be these unicorns that are able to take more. And it's not sustainable. It just isn't. So, it's hard out there. And I think sometimes when you know it's time, it's time. Or you find a different way to do it, right? Maybe you get out of the field and you become a desk editor or something where you're not out in the field. This next question is a little complicated, and this might open a debate, but that's good. I love debates. When you're working on a story and it touches your emotion in that moment, is it unprofessional to cry or show weakness in front of your interview?
I don't think it is. For me, it has happened to me like twice, I could say. And these stories that there's no way that you can try to hold it. There's no way. So I remember very much one story of a business owner. Right now he has like a few restaurants, and he was telling me all the story when he was in jail and he thought he wasn't going to be able to make it. And then he was telling me all the story, and now he's very successful. So, but when he's telling me this really sad story, it's like, oh my God, like you just, I mean, like like Jesus said, you're just human. I mean, like you have to feel. Of course, I'm not gonna be turned up and just like crying and asking for Kleenex, but of course, like, I mean, you're human. So for me, I don't think it's unprofessional, because that shows also a little more empathy towards the person, and that you do feel for them, so they feel comfortable, versus just being like, okay, keep talking because I gotta write a story.
Yeah, it's not weakness. You're just real. You're just real, and you're just connecting with another human being, which is what I love about this job, which is why I've been doing this since the 90s, you know, but it's what I love about this, because you are connecting with another human being. So yes, you're going to feel something. And that person, I think, is, you know, feels okay, feels validated when they see, you know, that you're mirroring them, you know, unintentionally. But if you're feeling emotion, they see that in your face, that's very validating for them, you know, so that helps make that conversation even richer. So yeah, I don't see it as a sign of weakness at all.
I have mixed feelings. I mean, I kind of feel like if it's authentic, you know, obviously if it's an authentic moment, especially for the broadcasters, you know, if it's authentic and we're going to see it, then obviously there's no point in suppressing it. It's something that can be very natural. I mean, we've seen recently, I think it was Miguel Marquez at CNN who cried after covering, you know, spending like a whole day inside a COVID unit. I do though remember that back in the day when Robin Roberts was sent to Mississippi to cover Hurricane Katrina, and she actually has a masterclass about this, which I highly recommend. She cried on air on Good Morning America because she basically had to go back to her hometown and saw it completely destroyed, and she cried on air. And she says, in that moment, I thought they were going to fire me. Like, I thought I wasn't going to have a career after that. And in fact, you know, we all love Robin Roberts, and one of the things that made her so relatable is the fact that she did show emotion. So I think, you know, it's controversial. I think for a long time we've been told not to, but I think there are those authentic moments where the occasion just merits it, right? And it's authentic. I will say this though, you can't be the reporter that's always crying everywhere you go, because then they're going to be, ay, la chillona, y viene la chillona. So it just depends, right? You can't be the reporter that's always chillona, because then that's too much. So I think it just depends. And you know, and I still think that a lot of news, I do think that a lot of managers may have issues with, I think a lot of managers may want you to hold it together in that moment, but as soon as the interview's over, okay, go and cry over there. Just to say that I do think that a lot of managers might feel that way, but I think it's changing, right? And I think that the fact that we can now see people like Robin Roberts, Miguel Marquez crying on national television is fantastic, because it's not something that you would always see.
Can I add my 2 cents about this?
Yes.
Which is, I do think that when it's genuine, and I know as a consumer, I feel that I've sat in a lot of these conversations, and I guess the one thing I would say too is that if the emotion is about the person, as in tune with the person, then that's one thing. If it's about yourself, that's probably where being emotional interferes with storytelling. Mm-hmm. But as long as it's in tune, as you were all saying, and I know as a viewer, like when I see someone cry, it's like, oh my God, makes it even more real. for me that how upsetting this is. But it's why I think we need to have emotional literacy, because if you're crying about your own issue that isn't connected to your source, that's where it could be problematic. And it's hard when you're doing trauma stuff because you can get triggered.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can go out into a story burned out. If you're already burned out the minute you get to a mass shooting, you're going to be in bad shape, you know, and you're probably going to cry over the smallest thing. So I think it's so important that when you do get those days, hey, this is for the young people. When you get your days off, use them wisely, use them to rest, use them to replenish. Don't use them to go party in Cancun, because then you're in Cancun all week, you know, and then you know who I'm talking about. So hey, we've all done it when we're younger, right? We get sent on these stories and we want vacation, but it ends up being like a partying vacation and you don't come back refreshed. So it's so important to create these healthy habits as journalists, because what we do is hard. So then, you know, if you're just abusing your days off and you're not actually using them wisely to rest and, you know, come back refurbished, then that can be an issue. All right, we have a few more questions. To Leslie, maybe, any suggestions on what to do if you had a conversation with your managers regarding the workload? In addition to watching the competition, I have to monitor social media, deal with emails, Slack messages, and police scanners. They are basically, I think she meant tone deaf, or they're turned a deaf ear. So, I mean, like, look, lately journalism is, you know, they're requiring you to do the work of 5 people. And
Yeah.
so if you are tired of telling them, this is too much, I can't handle this much, what do you do?
You know, I'm going to admit that as soon as we're done, I have like 2 more hours of work to do right now. So it is what it is. You know, we try to be conscientious about it. We do have, you know, a union. And, you know, I mean, our reporters are protected by that. So, you know, if you're burned out, you know, I should say, wait, let me back up. If you're working, first of all, if you're working too many hours and you can ask for overtime, ask for overtime. And you can also, you know, if you can get comp time, get comp time. But yeah, talk to them. Yes, I know we all have to be multitasking all the time. We have to be tweeting. We have to be, you know, watching the competition. I mean, I'm always constantly like scanning for what's going on. I've learned not to do it at night because it keeps me up at night, but I do it early in the morning. We are doing this, and it's a lot of work, and it is what is asked of us these days. But again, I'll just say, like, you know, if you have been going nonstop, you know, for like a month, you know, you need a break, please bring it up, because you're just going to get burnt out and then you're not going to do good work. And just bring up that argument. I'm tired. I just need like a little bit of time to rest, you know, and just bring it up. I mean, you may be pleasantly surprised. Plan around it. Now, this is one thing, like, okay, up until, you know, actually I probably still can't do it, but I would never take any time off in June, because that's Supreme Court month, right? And there was always some kind of big immigration decision coming for the Supreme Court every June, so I would never take any time off then. So of course, be conscientious, right? Look at your schedule. If you have a big city council meeting coming up or whatever, don't take that day off, but try to plan with your editor just so you can get some rest. And you know, have a voice. You know, if they say no, try again in a few days, but just keep trying, because we're all getting burned out, and I think everybody recognizes that.
Yeah. I don't know if this person is Latino or not, but I will say this. As Latinos, we've been taught to be like super loyal employees. And I think that is I think it's a huge mistake. I really do. I mean, like, look, whether you have a job or not, you should always be looking. There should always be options, right? I mean, even if you are a million times happy at your job, you never stop looking. You have to have, you know, other conversations with other people, or maybe, you know, because you don't ever want to feel like you're stuck in a job where you've had multiple conversations with your bosses and things are not changing, and you feel stuck and you feel like you have to do it because there are no other options. Well, in that case, part of the fault is yours, because you should be having, you know, conversations all the time with the competition or with other people. There should always be another option. And look, I didn't feel like this 10 years ago, but I do now. At the end of the day, it's just a job, okay? And I think that we have a problem with that. Like, we always want to be so loyal to our careers that we get so like, oh my God, I would not be able to survive if I'm not here. You'll survive, you'll find something else. It's just a job, Like, don't kill yourself for it. I hope
You
my
know,
bosses aren't on here.
you know, I'll say this too. I mean, also, again, you know, coming as Latinos, we always like, you know, let's face it, there's a lot of imposter syndrome that goes around, right? You know, sometimes we wait for that little tap on, you know, tap on the shoulder. I mean, especially like look, I went to community college and a Cal State. I don't have a master's degree. You know? And at the time that I entered the business, a lot of people did. And sometimes I would wait for that tap on the shoulder saying, you don't belong here. And you know what? You do belong here. And you know what? You have a lot of skills. I would say sometimes, well, this is what I have to do because all I can do is type fast. I have no other job skills. I would tell myself this when I was younger. Don't tell myself that anymore. But I mean, you know, if you want to, you know, go back to school, if there's, I mean, you know, like you said, there are other things that you can do if you don't feel like this is the place to be, you know, right now. And don't sell yourself short because this has trained you for so many things.
Right. And the last thing I would say about this before we move on, because we do have one more question and then we'll have to wrap things up, is, and this might be like my training as a producer, but I think we got to be problem solvers. And I think it's one thing to go to your boss and complain, like, you make me do this and this and this and this, and you're just nagging and complaining. But when you can present a solution, hey, like, here's the problem. I'm doing this and this, but I also have a solution. Or I have, or I'm laying out 3 potential scenarios, you know, in order to alleviate this, we could do this or this or this. I think just having, you know, presenting the solution and not just the problem is super important, because then you're troubleshooting and then you're giving your, it's always good to trick your bosses into, like, you know, thinking that they had an idea when really you had it and you just presented it. But I think that when you're not presenting the solution or possible solutions, then you just come off as a complainer because you're not presenting, you know, a viable option to rectify what you're complaining about. Okay, we have one last question. It's a little it's not related directly to what we're talking about, but we should answer it because we do have a lot of students on who are watching us. What is your advice for new graduates? Okay, we have an entire class of students who are very talented, poor students. They didn't even get a graduation. And then now we're saying, go out into the workforce and get a job, but there really aren't many jobs out there. How can they navigate this difficult climate? Like, what are some of your tips for the new graduates?
I wanna answer that question because when I saw it, it caught my attention a lot. One of the things that we gotta remember, and maybe it happened to us, I don't know if it happened to you guys, but it happened to me for different reasons, but not always we're gonna find the job as soon as we graduate. I mean, we graduated, we have the degree, but that doesn't mean that we have the experience or we have everything that they need. When I graduated in 2010, and the reason because I couldn't find a job right away is because I didn't have papers until 2012 when DACA appeared. So I was one of the documented people. And it was very interesting because even though I was 2 years without working in journalism, I never stopped looking. I always try to do freelancing. I always try to do a lot of free work, believe me, because my point back then, it was, I don't want people to forget about me. I don't want people to forget about my name. I want to have my bylines out there. I want to have my name out there. So I know that right now the situation is very different. And like what Jesus said, like, it's pretty sad that just the fact that they didn't have a graduation. But even if they had had a graduation, just think how many of them really were going to get to that job of their dreams the next day. It takes time. It takes time because then I saw that with other classmates that they had papers, they were citizens, they were legal residents, and they were passing through the same thing. Some of them took them a year, some of them took them 2 years. But the most important thing that I would say is don't stop. If you really love journalism, don't stop working on it. If you have to go back to your school newspaper, because that's what I did for a year. I went back to my school newspaper and I was collaborating with them all the time. So just try to put your name out there if you really want to be a journalist, whatever it is, TV, radio, print. So just try to volunteer yourself, try to do freelancing. If you can see that you can make money doing freelancing, do it until you find the job of your dreams, and it's going to happen.
Right. How about you, Leslie?
Use that same work ethic that you saw in your families, that same work ethic, right? Just, you go and you keep going and you keep going. You don't say no. I mean, sometimes, don't think that's when early on, especially, don't even think that the work is beneath you, because you might be tempted to think like, I've been at this for 4 years. Why am I writing police briefs? Well, you're going to write police briefs and you're doing really well. You can do them better than anybody else. And then that's going to help you get the next step up the ladder. So you're just gonna have to just hang tough and work really hard. You're not gonna have the job of your dreams right away, but if you persevere and just come up with ideas, think, do, do this thing where you convince your editor that they've had a good idea when it's your idea. Just keep on plugging away, but persevere and you will get there. Don't give up.
Right. And then, most of you have been out of school for a couple months now, right? But, the journalism doesn't stop just because you have graduated. So if your demo reel or your portfolio is showing me clips from like 4 months ago, my first question as an editor or as, as someone who hires is like, well, what did you do over the summer? Like, were you just chilling at home? Like, how did you cover COVID? I mean, I've said this in all my classes. COVID is the story of the century, not the decade, the century. So if you don't have a very strong COVID story, you already effed up. Like that has to be like the lead story, like here is what I did. And then look, it opens up a conversation. How did you do this? Oh, I shot on my phone. Oh, I edited it this way. So, COVID has to be a story. So if you're a student and you have not covered COVID in any shape, way, or form, then as soon as this panel is over, you need to start researching a story that's COVID related. And that needs to be like the one story that you hit the home run on, because as a news editor or as someone who hires, that's going to be our first question. Like, show me how you've covered it. And if the answer is I haven't, well, then now I'm wondering, like, what, are you even passionate about the news? What do you mean you haven't covered it? It's like the story of the century. Like, why not? So it goes back to what Leslie's saying is you have to have the work ethic and you need to have that news judgment. And right now it's even this conversation, like this is a story, right? I mean, so you got to put on your hat and be like, you just can't be relying on what you produced in school because it's been 4 months. So what do you have to show now?
Exactly.
All right, I have one more question. I'm sorry, I didn't know I had it because it was in the Q&A. And then we'll wrap up because Elana's on the East Coast, so it's late over there. So if you have an anxiety or a panic attack, and in this case, the person said at school, how do you handle it? But I mean, this could happen to anyone, right? It could happen on the job. Like I said, it happened to one of my colleagues live on air. But if it gets to that point where someone has a full-blown panic attack, how would they go about addressing it? I think we already touched on it, but I want to address it just because it is an important question. Oh, you're muted, Elana.
Got it. So I think when you have anxiety, one needs to deal with it however one can deal with it. I think that if you have a full-blown panic attack, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. If you experience it and then you need to deal with it, I don't know exactly.
It's just if you had a panic attack at school, how would you handle it?
So sometimes people use the word panic attack when they're really anxious, and sometimes they use it when they've actually had a full-blown panic attack. So let me answer both of those because I don't really know which it is, which is I think that when you are anxious, it's important to do things that will make you less anxious. So sometimes it can feel like you're having a full-blown anxiety attack when you're just slightly anxious. And sometimes you can have a full-blown anxiety attack. If you have a full-blown anxiety attack, you will start feeling like you are having a heart attack, and you will stop doing things, and then you will eventually get better. The thing about it will get better is, I guess what I would say, is to hang on and to focus. And I think it also relates to what you were just hearing about jobs too, which is, when you feel out of control, the most important thing to do is to take an action, any action, and move forward toward your goal a little bit or a lot, but having some sense of whatever it is that makes you feel in control at the moment, I think is important and is a way to handle stress. And that's what we're all, encouraging, is take one step. It doesn't have to be the perfect step, but a step forward, whether it's for your career and whether it's for your anxiety management.
Yeah. And it goes back to some of the things we already talked about, right? If it gets to the point where you've had a full-blown panic attack, then you're overly stressed. So, you haven't done a good job of doing some of the things that we talked about earlier, like tuning out, exercising. So we know that when people have full-blown panic attacks, you know, their cortisol levels rise to like, you know, crazy levels. And, you know, maybe they're not doing a good job of taking care of their, you know, vitamin levels. Like we know that people that have low B levels, you know, will be stressed out easier. In fact, one alternative to like the Xanax and all those other things that people do is just B12 supplementation, because people that have very low levels of B level will just have anxiety more than other people. So, you know, you got to be diligent about taking care of your health, making sure that you get a blood panel every, you know, year. If you have the health insurance, use it. It's there for a reason. You got to exercise. You got to do everything. I know it may sound like we're asking you to be unicorns, but go ahead,
I do want
Elana.
to add one other thing, which is, you know, I've been talking a lot about reactions and not talking about disorders, because I think that that's what for most people it's uncomfortable stress reactions. But I do want to say that panic disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are very treatable conditions. And particularly if you catch them early, there are many evidence-based treatments that are helpful. And I just want to encourage that as well, that there are therapies that can help with those things and depression early on. So again, I'd like to reduce stigma, that ask for help when you need it as well.
All right. And on that note, we're going to land this plane. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor to moderate this for you. I think the big takeaway is like, look, we just got to talk about this. We can't allow it to go back to how it used to be, where this is something that is taboo and becomes a stigma. So whether you're addressing it with your friends or fellow classmates or fellow coworkers, you know, whenever things become too stressful or too emotional, we just got to reach out to people and, you know, do a better job of making sure that we're discussing this, especially in the Latino community, because like I said, I know that our parents are not the most educated when it comes to mental health hygiene. They haven't trained us well. You know, anytime someone, you know, mentioned mental health in my family, you know, it always somehow became about, ay, es que está loca. And it's like, no, mom, like, you know, it's okay. Like, this is a good thing. So, you know, it just, unfortunately, you know, it is a stigma in our community. And so, you know, maybe we're like the first people in our families that are realizing that mental health is important and that therapy is important. And so, you know, we need to keep that conversation going so that the cycle gets broken. So thank you to the panelists. We really appreciate your time. And now I'll turn it over to Christina.
Thank you so much, guys. I really learned a lot. I really liked everything you all said, but especially the idea of reaching out to your colleague, maybe sitting in their yard if you can, or making the time to call someone really quickly to say a silly joke. At one point, I was really bored and feeling depressed, so I started sending people silly postcards and just said like a really silly, like, how did the chicken cross the road jokes, because I wanted to cheer myself up and hopefully cheer them up too. So I got desperate there for a while. So be creative in how you're working things out. If you have any questions, please reach out to the panelists or myself. Everyone here is very kind and I'm sure very, you know, willing to be very helpful. We will have a recording and tips that we sent out, and please, please, please continue having these conversations. Like everyone said, there's no need to feel ashamed. There's no need to feel like there's anything wrong with you. This is totally normal. We're all going through this historic, very difficult time, and we have to be there for each other. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our moderator. Thank you to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a really good week. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.